Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to get into it today?
Always ready to dive in.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be looking at something that's pretty controversial and complex.
Mm.
We're going to be looking at the New York Times and their coverage of trans issues.
Yeah,
And this is something that people have a lot of opinions on. And we're going to try to break it down and really look at it from an analytical point of view.
absolutely.
We're not going to be talking about our personal opinions or, taking any sides or anything like that. We really just want to dive into this topic.
Right.
And our main source for this is going to be an interview with Tuck Woodstock, who is a trans media critic and the host of the Gender Reveal podcast.
Oh, okay.
And they were interviewed on the You're Wrong About podcast.
I love that podcast.
Oh, it's so good. It's one of my favorites. And they had some really, really interesting insights into how the New York Times has been covering this very important issue.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, New York Times is like the gold standard of journalism. So I'm really interested to see what they have to say about it.
Yeah, definitely. So to get started, one of the things that Tuck talks about is how the concept of journalistic objectivity
Yeah.
can actually be weaponized,
Oh, okay.
which is a really interesting
You've
take.
never thought about it that way.
So can you kind of unpack that for us a little bit? What do they mean by that?
Well, objectivity is kind of like this core principle of journalism, right? Like you
Yeah,
have
right.
to present both sides of the story and you can't be biased and,
Yeah.
all that good stuff. But what Tuck is saying is that in the pursuit of this like balance,
Yeah.
it can sometimes lead to silencing the voices of people who are already marginalized.
Interesting.
Like by trying to appear unbiased, you end up giving equal weight to sources that are not actually equal in terms of their expertise or their lived experience.
Oh, that's so interesting. So it's not just about presenting both sides of the story,
Right.
but it's also about thinking critically about who you're getting those sides from. And are they,
Yeah, like what is their motive? What is their background?
right, are they actually qualified to be speaking on this topic?
Exactly.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah.
Um, and Tuck actually gives this really powerful example from the Washington Post.
Okay.
It was an article about trans athletes in women's sports.
Mm-hmm.
And the main source that they were interviewing for this article
Yeah.
was a pharmacy technician
Okay.
who admitted to having transphobic views.
Wow.
Right. And so they're presenting this person's opinions as equivalent to the experiences of actual trans athletes
Right.
or medical professionals.
Yeah, or, like scientists.
Yeah, exactly.
Who have done like studies on this.
Yeah, exactly. And that to me is so,
It's kind of shocking, honestly.
yeah.
Yeah.
I get that you want to present, different perspectives and stuff.
Right.
But that to me seems like a really clear example of
Yeah.
how this false equivalence can happen,
Totally.
where you're presenting an opinion as a fact.
Yeah, and it gives this like air of legitimacy to these opinions that maybe they shouldn't have.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is where Tuck really starts to talk about the New York Times and their coverage.
Okay.
And they point out that the Times really tends to focus on these controversies surrounding trans youth,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to gender affirming care.
Right. Right. Like I've seen a lot of articles about like,
Yeah.
the debate over
Yeah.
puberty blockers and things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, is this focus on controversy really an accurate reflection of what's happening?
Oh, that's a good.
Is this
yeah.
really the biggest issue?
Right, because it kind of creates this sense of like urgency
Yeah.
and it makes it seem like this is like a huge problem.
Yes.
When in reality, it might not be as widespread
Yeah.
as they're making it seem.
Exactly. And it also, kind of overshadows
Yeah.
the other really important things that are happening
Really?
that are affecting trans youth.
Like what kinds of things?
Anti-trans legislation.
Right.
And violence against trans people.
Right.
These are things that are happening,
Yeah.
but they're not getting as much attention.
And they're very real.
Exactly. So it's not just about what they're reporting on, but it's also about
Yes.
what they're leaving out.
Totally.
Right.
Right.
And that can have a huge impact on how the public perceives these
Oh.
issues.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you're only hearing about the controversy,
Yeah.
then you're not getting the full picture.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm really interested to hear more about what they have to say about the New York Times specifically.
And me too. Me too.
Yeah.
So let's take a quick break.
Okay.
And then when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into this.
Sounds good. So one thing that's really interesting that Tuck brought up is that these articles, these like seemingly objective explorations of trans issues.
Can have really tangible consequences, like they're being used in legal briefs to support discriminatory legislation.
Oh, wow. That's scary. So they're using these articles to actually justify taking away people's rights.
It's really concerning. For example, the Arkansas Attorney General
Yeah.
used New York Times articles in a legal brief that was defending a law that could imprison medical providers for giving gender-affirming care to trans youth.
Wow. That's really disturbing. That's not just an abstract debate anymore, right? Like these are real-world consequences for people.
It really highlights that idea of impact over intent. You know, the Times might say, oh, we're just reporting on the facts.
Yeah.
But the way they present those facts and the sources they choose to platform
Right.
can have these huge ripple effects.
It feels like a really big responsibility for these publications,
Yeah.
especially ones as influential as the New York Times,
Absolutely.
to make sure that they're not contributing to harm.
Yeah, and it's not just about the facts that they're choosing to report on. It's also about the language that they use.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So Tuck talks about how the Times consistently uses phrases like identifies as when referring to trans people.
I see what you mean. It's almost like they're questioning
Right.
if someone's gender identity is really real.
Right, exactly. Like it's just a choice.
Yeah.
Or like it's not a valid identity.
It's almost like the language itself is othering them instead of
Right.
embracing their experiences.
Exactly.
And it's not just the identifies as thing. They also refuse to update past bylines to reflect name changes.
Yeah. Can you imagine pouring your heart into your writing for a place like the New York Times,
Yeah,
and then your dead name is just attached to all your work?
right. And your dead name is like
Right?
a name that you've chosen to leave behind.
Yeah, it would be so invalidating. It's like
Yeah.
a lack of respect for trans people's identities.
Yeah, and so, this concerns we're talking about, they haven't just come out of nowhere, right? Like
Right.
trans journalists and contributors at the New York Times.
Have been bringing these things up internally,
Right.
but the response has been
Not great.
not great.
A lot of dismissal, a lot of defensiveness, and even threats of like disciplinary action.
Wow, really?
There was this letter signed by over 1,200 contributors criticizing the Times coverage.
Mm.
And they basically ignored it.
Wow, so they're silencing these voices instead of having conversation with them.
It's really frustrating. They focused on a separate letter that was from GLAD,
Okay.
which is an LGBTQ advocacy organization.
Yeah.
And they accused the journalists who wrote the first letter of attacking their colleagues.
Oh.
It's like they're trying to shut down any kind of criticism.
Get deflecting instead
Yeah.
of like really listening.
Yeah, and I think it makes you wonder, like, are they really committed to journalistic integrity?
Yeah, like is it more about protecting their image
Right.
than
and
actually doing the right thing?
it's hard to say, but it's definitely not a good look.
Right, so are there other media outlets that are doing a better job
Yeah,
at covering these issues?
absolutely. There are definitely other outlets doing it better.
So it's not impossible.
Not at all. For example, Tuck's own podcast, Gender Reveal, is doing amazing work centering trans voices and giving a platform to those perspectives.
That makes me feel a little bit better at least. Like change is possible.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
And this is something that Tuck really emphasizes. This isn't inevitable, The New York Times has the power to change.
Yeah.
They have the platform, they have the resources, they could be a leader in this space. They could be helping to shift public understanding
Right.
and actually creating positive change.
So what's stopping them then? Is it just that they're like stuck in their ways? Or is there something more to it?
It's probably a mix of things. There's definitely like an institutional resistance to change. They might be scared of alienating some of their readers.
Right.
And I also think there's a lack of understanding about how much harm their coverage is causing.
Okay, so what can we do? Like as readers, as citizens, what can we do to hold these institutions accountable?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that like this idea of objectivity in journalism,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a myth, Every news outlet has a perspective. They
Yeah.
all have biases. They all have an agenda. So it's our job to be aware of that and to really think critically about the information that we're getting.
So we can't just like blindly trust what we read.
Right, exactly. We have to be willing to question the framing,
Yeah.
to consider the sources,
Yeah.
to look for those blind spots.
And to call them out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like if you see something that's biased or harmful,
Yeah.
write a letter to the editor, talk about it on social media, support those alternative media outlets that are doing a better job.
Yeah. Like, we have a responsibility to be active participants in this.
Exactly. We have to demand better from these institutions that have so much power.
Yeah.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we know about how media works and how bias can show up, the better equipped we are to advocate for change.
This has been a really insightful conversation. It's made me think about a lot of things that I haven't really considered before.
It's a complex issue,
Yeah.
but it's so important to talk about these things.
It is. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the New York Times and their coverage of trans issues.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It was really great to have you here. And to everyone listening, we hope you found this conversation as thought-provoking as we did.
Yeah, and remember to keep these things in mind the next time you're reading the news.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in making sure that the media is fair and accurate and representative of everyone. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We love hearing from you guys, and we'll see you next time.